Good evening, everyone. We're going to continue with our long course on Swami Kriyananda's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. So we are not quite halfway through, but we're in no hurry. People have been studying this for generations. We can spend one generation doing it too. So let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dear friend Swami Kriyananda, help us to feel the wisdom of your teaching and your recollection of Master's explanations of this great scripture. Help us to feel the power of the Bhagavad Gita that has guided the Indian civilization for so many centuries. Help us to understand how ancient wisdom can be lived in these times and can take us through the never-ending confusion of human life to the joy, the security, and the freedom of divine realization. Om, peace. Amen. All right, my friends. We are on chapter 6. We are on verse 28. So let's see what happens tonight. 6:28. The yogi, here we are in this section. This is actually a collection of 5 verses altogether before there's commentary. I'll just back up a little bit. We were talking about the state of mind of the yogi. And as part of this section, I'll read the 2 verses that we talked about last week. Each time the fickle, wavering mind wanders from its course, let him withdraw it and redirect it toward the task of bringing it under control. 6:27. The yogi who has completely calmed his mind, whose passions, rajoguna, are at rest, and who is freed from every impurity, truly attains oneness with the Spirit and supreme blessedness. And starting tonight, 6:28, the yogi, freed from imperfection, ceaselessly engaged in activities that lead to divine union, easily attains the state of blissful union with Spirit. I really like that phrase, ceaselessly engaged in activities that lead to divine union. When I read that, I started thinking, what activities lead to divine union? And the actual fact is, all activities can lead to divine union if we conduct them with that end in mind. Even those things which accidentally take us away from divine union can awaken us to the need to behave in such a way that we're moving toward the light and not away from it. Wonderful phrase, ceaselessly engaged in activities that lead to divine union. It's one of the many facts that I've always enjoyed about being on the spiritual path from when I very first learned about it, and especially after I met Swami Kriyananda, is that there's always something you can do, because it all comes down to your inner state of consciousness. So whereas many things about the external world are simply beyond our control, we always have a choice, at least in theory. Sometimes we are compelled by the momentum of our vrittis. But in principle, we always have a choice about what kind of an inner attitude we're going to have In other words, what kind of inner consciousness we're going to have. Swamiji said when Master was living, and he was in the company of Yogananda, he said when he was with the disciples, he would put so much emphasis on right attitude. And attitude is not what you're doing so much as how you feel about what you're doing, what kind of understanding you have of what you're doing. Swamiji says, even if you do wrong things in the sense of actions that lead away from divine union instead of toward it, even if you do those with an attitude of this isn't really me, this is an error I'm making, but it doesn't define me, and even more touchingly, that if you bring God with you, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing with your life, if you realize that nothing can ever separate you from the presence of God except our inattention to that presence. Viktor Frankl, who wrote a very powerful book called Search for Meaning, that was catalyzed by his experience being incarcerated during the Second World War as a Jewish prisoner of the Nazis. And absolutely everything was taken away from them. He himself was a very intellectual man. He was a psychiatrist before he was arrested. He was 24 years old, but he was already an educated professional. And his interest was intellectual, and he had written a manuscript, a book he was writing, or a dissertation, I don't know what it was. And when they were arrested and he had to flee from his home, and he lived in a comfortable house and was, privileged on many levels, he took his manuscript with him because it was the most valuable possession he had. And he hid it in perhaps the lining of his coat. When they were arrested, and when the people were arrested in that way, people grabbed what they thought would be of value. Many people hid money or jewels or heirlooms, in their clothing, thinking that this would help them for the next stage. But they were so brutally treated that at the beginning of their incarceration, everything they were wearing was stripped away and stolen from them. So they literally had nothing but their physical bodies, and in many cases, not even the clothes that were on their back. So when he was there, he said, and he had his manuscript hidden in his clothes, and the guards just saw it, grabbed it, and threw it on the trash heap. And this was like the fruit of who he was and all the labor. Of course, this is, 1940. It's not like you have computers and copies and things like that. When it was gone, it was absolutely gone. And Frankl writes about how in that moment, he just saw what his choices were, which is that he could put himself, he could define himself by what he'd created intellectually, and therefore the loss of it was the loss of himself. And that was the obvious thing to do, and that was his first response. But he realized if he went in that direction, this experience was going to destroy his life. But he realized that that manuscript was the fruit of his own consciousness. And the manuscript had been stolen, but his consciousness still belonged to him. And so in the next 4 or 5 years, and I mean, these are experiences that none of us hope to have, but over the next 4 or 5 years, and he didn't realize it, but his wife and all of his family was killed almost immediately. He survived for many years, but he didn't know that his people had died, partly because the spirit of his wife stayed with him. He said he communed with her, conversed with her, spent time with her in probably from the spirit world, I guess, because in his mind he was with her a great deal, and only after he came out did he find out that she had died years before. It's just a very interesting feature of it. But he made the decision that his consciousness would always belong to him, no matter what went on around him. So therefore you think, ceaselessly engaged in activities that lead to divine union. Well, divine union is the transcendence of all limiting conditions. And that kind of brutal imprisonment is the destruction of everything except your own consciousness. And so we would think of it as a curse, but you could also think of it as a blessing, which is what one rabbi, whose name I don't know, I read an article by him, he wrote that way. He said it was the shining hour for Jewish people because it was the opportunity to prove to themselves and to the world that all they ever need is the experience of God. Now, only a few were able to take it that way, but Master said a lot of people became saints in the concentration camp because the choice became so stark that those who made the choice had so much incentive to make it with so much power that often they just broke free of all limitation. See, this world is very different than we think. So the yogi, freed from imperfection, ceaselessly engaged in activities that lead to divine union, easily attains the state of blissful union with spirit. I love that promise. Easily attains the state. Number 629. United to the Supreme Self by the practice of yoga, he beholds his self in all beings, and all beings in that one self. This is always the answer that the yogi has to both keep foremost in his own mind, and that there is sometimes people make a philosophical objection to their misunderstanding of what the practice of the path of self-realization is, or the practice of the path of meditation, or a commitment to the idea of karma and reincarnation. That the belief is that will make you selfish, not self-realized, but selfish. Selfishly concerned with self, with your own reality, and selfishly unconcerned about the reality of others. But the answer to that is in this particular verse, among others. United to the Supreme Self, which is to the divine power within us by the practice of yoga, which is those ways of living that lead to that union, which is everything that's in the Bhagavad Gita and everything that's on this whole spiritual path. Chanting, meditation, devotion to God, mantra, kriya, pranayama, everything that leads to yoga. He sees, once we see the divine self within us, we see the divine in everyone, and we see everyone as being part of that divine. And I'm reminded in this instance about how this man who came to visit Ananda many years ago and met Swami Kriyananda was just overwhelmed by the love he received from people. And he especially spoke to Swami, but he spoke of many. He said, how is it possible? He said, for you all who don't even know me, to treat me with so much love. Swami's answer was very simple. He said, we already love God, and when we look at you, we see in you the God we already love. That's exactly this verse 629. When we realize the self within, we look all around us and we see that divine self everywhere. And in the experience of that power of divine love, one can't think in any other way except in a loving way. There's stories about Yogananda and many other saints, but also about Master, of being able to tame even wild creatures. Swami would tell this story about Master. Swami put this into his play, The Jewel in the Lotus, where the main character is a storyteller who The play is set 200 years in the future. And the storyteller had been a disciple of Yogananda 200 years previously, when Yogananda was Yogananda in this world in Los Angeles. Master said that he would reincarnate 200 years in the future, presumably 200 years after his passing, which was 1952. And so this play is set 200 years in the future. And the storyteller had been a disloyal disciple to Yogananda. He'd become falsely persuaded that Yogananda was not a true teacher, or had betrayed him in some way, and then had a realization of his error. This is all the storyteller's backstory, so to speak, and realized his error and was going to make peace with his guru, but he arrived too late. His guru had already died. So the storyteller makes this deep prayer to his guru and asks to be able to remember that life so that he can constantly compensate for his disloyalty in that life by bringing people to Master. Just as he spoke against him in that incarnation, he would spend his future incarnations bringing people to Master. So it's a very, very sweet story. Now let me think what the point was. Just a second, I lost the thought here for a second. Oh yes, and so in the play, the storyteller wanders around and finds those who will listen, and then he tells them wonderful stories about Yogananda to inspire them to love the Master now as the storyteller loves the Master. And one of the stories he tells is about when Master was in rural India and was traveling through a jungle area in a cart that was pulled by bullocks, and then they had to camp for the night in a hut. And the cart driver had been careless, and he'd put the animals in a shed, but he'd failed to secure that shed against the encroachment of wild tigers. And so if the animals were eaten, if the cows were eaten by the tiger, the people would not be able to get out of that jungle because the walking would be too long, and then they would be caught in the jungle at night, and the tigers could easily eat them. So in the story, Yogananda looks out from the window of the hut, and he sees a hungry tiger coming forward, and he's stalking the cows, and it's really the calamity's about to happen. So Master realizes that he has to go out to save them all. So he invites, any of his traveling companions to go with him to confront the hungry tiger, and no one wanted to go at all. So Master steps out with a lantern, a little bit of fire, to protect him, and then the wind blows out the fire. And so Master's standing alone with a hungry tiger, and the tiger suddenly sees that there's an even easier prey than the cow, and he starts coming toward Master. And this is a true story, Master looked at the tiger, and he realized that the God whom he loved was as much present in the tiger as he was anywhere else in creation. Because once that divine vision comes to us, the Masters tell us, we see that everything in this manifested world is just a vibration of God's consciousness, just a materialization of the pure love of the divine. So Master loved the tiger as he loved God, as he loved people, as he loved nature. And the tiger felt that love, and it was impossible in the presence of that kind of divine understanding for any harmful vibrations to arise. This is the perfect practice of Ahimsa, which is one of Patanjali's basic virtues that we have to practice. Ahimsa is harmlessness. And when we have perfected the practice of harmlessness, which is everything is equal to us and no shred of fear or malice exists within us, then no harm can arise in our presence. So the tiger just became a playful kitten and literally just stopped stalking, but came to Master and rolled over and exposed its tummy, and Master was able to pet it like a kitten. And then the tiger just walked off and went in search of another prey. It's very hard for us to imagine this. There's a story about Sri Yukteswar when he was confronted by a cobra, and the cobra had its hood up. Very, very dangerous. We don't, in California, we don't really think about cobras, but when you live in a place where poisonous snakes, especially cobras, exist, you understand. And apparently one of the ways you avoid being, because when the cobra's raised with its hood up, it's ready to strike, because that's how it defends itself. And apparently what you do, this I understand from reading this story, is that you remain absolutely still. But when Sri Yukteswar saw the cobra, he started clapping his hands rhythmically, which is exactly the opposite, apparently, what you're supposed to do. But he just saw the cobra. He just saw Brother Cobra. He saw Divine Mother expressed as Brother Cobra. And the cobra just felt that there was nothing to fear, nothing to attack here. And he just dropped his hood. And as I think as the story is told, he actually slithered between Sri Yukteswar's legs and just went off. And Sri Yukteswar never hesitated. He never felt. There was never any agitation. This is what St. Paul, or perhaps St. John, I forget now, says in the New Testament or in the letters afterwards. Perfect love casts out all fear. How do we perfect that love? We can perfect that love by affirmation. We can practice that love by trying. We can discipline ourselves to behave kindly. But it's quite different when it's a spontaneous act of sympathy. I had a very pleasant, for me, moment in a situation where I was pleased to see my own reaction. We went through, as a community, as an entity, Ananda as an entity, we went through 12 years of litigation, 2 lawsuits. And it took us more than a decade to get through them. The first one was about intellectual property and religious freedom. The second one, and that one went very much in our favor, and as a consequence, a second attempt was made by the shadow force to pull Ananda down, and that was character assassination, that Ananda was a vicious cult, that Swami was not a true teacher, that, everything. The actual lawsuit was filed by an attorney who had sued other cults, as he called them. His career was busting up what he was on a campaign against spiritual teachers, and he just filed lawsuits. And the lawsuit he filed against us was actually a boilerplate anti-cult lawsuit. And it was just, just take whatever you could accuse: abuse of power, abuse of women, sexual perversion, false teaching, financial impropriety, just everything you could think of. It was just listed out, boilerplate. And in some places, even when they filed it, they forgot to put our name in. And so every so often there would be a paragraph in which someone else was being accused of all of this because he just dropped it in. And they found one woman who had a grudge against us and was willing to give a lot of false testimony. It was a very unpleasant experience. And that particular person really did things that she should not have done, that were not good for her. Karmically, they were not good for her. And when the verdict finally came down, and it came down strongly against us, as Swamiji said at the time, the law of averages say that some things will go in your favor. And when we went through that whole part of the litigation years, everything went against us. The judge was against us. The lawyer was unscrupulous. Every aspect of it, nothing went in our favor. And Swami said, when everything goes against you, you have to know that Divine Mother has a plan. So that was what we went through. And then the verdict came down, and you're sitting in the courtroom, and there was a jury, and they come back, and they just decided that they believed it all. And so we were judged morally reprehensible. I'm not sure that's actually a legal phrase, but that's what we were judged. But here's the part that was so interesting to me. In the moment that the verdict was given and I saw that, wow, they believed her, my first thought, I felt very, very sympathetic toward her. And this is actually really what I said. I sort of, under my breath, oh no, now she's won. That's going to increase the delusion that she was right. It will take her even longer to expiate this karma. And I felt very sorry for her because it was unfortunate what she did. And I think it's going to, I don't know anything about what happened to her, but I think it's going to take her a while before it balances. But the next thought I had was, thank you, God, for just helping me. I mean, there were so many other reactions I could have had, but that was the one, you know? It just made me feel, oh, spiritual life works. We just keep at it. We keep ceaselessly engaged in activities that lead to divine union. And then sooner or later, I've always thought of it like this. It's just the picture that I have in my mind. I was never into any kind of teenage activities like that, but where I grew up in El Paso, Texas, teenagers spent a lot of time doing useless things. And one of the things they did was drag racing. I lived out in El Paso, and it's a big desert area. People could go out to these abandoned desert areas, and they would have their souped-up cars, and they would sit next to each other, and then they would try to drive really fast and see who could drive faster than the other person. These things were of so little interest to me. I hope I haven't really just insulted too many people, but so I always had this image in my mind of people drag racing like that. When I got onto the spiritual path, and I began to understand that I and everyone had these different samskars. Samskars are impressions left on our consciousness from past actions. There's so many wonderful words, and samskars is one of them. You just have an impression. You meet someone, and you have a very positive feeling toward them. People who've been important in my life, well, Swami Kriyananda to start with, I just recognized him and made a lifetime commitment that never wavered, hasn't wavered to this point, in about 15 seconds. I mean, there's no explanation for that. It's completely illogical, except that I had a samskar. And that samskar was, I know this man. I trust him. He's been my friend and my teacher, and here he is again. It's just like, oh, hello, there you are. It would be like somebody stepped out of the room and stepped back into it. That's what it felt like. And then when I was first introduced to self-realization through a book by Swami Vivekananda, I had a deep samskar of studying these teachings. And this teaching had already made a deep impression on my consciousness, so I just recognized it. I didn't have to be persuaded by anything. I just recognized it. That's the only thing you can say. We all have experiences like that. And at the same time, you know, there's these positive samskars that lead me towards ceaselessly engaging in activities that lead to divine union. And then there's the other karma that I have. And the karma that says, what about me? Nobody pays attention to me properly. I'm not appreciated. Nobody understands. I don't want to have to work so hard. I mean, whatever, you know. And then you also have the samskars of, oh, it's you, you know, you, and all of that happens there. But I always felt like my good karma and my bad karma were sort of in a drag race. And by bad karma, I mean those activities that lead me into further enmeshment with Maya, that strengthen the ego, that do not lead to divine union, but lead to a sense of sadness and separation. And those forces were also there, you know, all the things, restlessnesses and things I want, unwillingness to meditate, restlessness in meditation, laziness, blah, 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 blah. And it was like they were always vying like this. And because I was taken into the ashram so early in my adult life and given so many opportunities to serve, that service was like the acceleration of the good karma. I cooked, you know, I worked for Swamiji, I helped with the publications. I was just busy, 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 trying to do things. much of it was not very productive, but at least I was spinning energy like this. And I just felt like the two were always vying, my selfishness and my desire to be in tune, like this. And I knew that if I just kept putting energy into the good side, which is if I ceaselessly engaged in those activities which lead to divine union, that finally the good karma would cut off the bad karma. And that was just, it was just a picture. And even to this day, it's like whenever I become agitated about the negative samskars that are still there, I know that if I just keep putting energy into this side, divine union will come. It's one of the things that we have to work with on the spiritual path, which is one of the reasons why I talk so much and I give so many classes. I think I'm balancing whatever doubts I may have had in the past, and it's also because I suffered. I suffered from lack of meaning. I suffered in past lives from not fully comprehending the necessity for divine effort. I want to give people as much opportunity as possible to become persuaded of the power and truth of this. Because there comes a certain point, and I don't want to be presumptuous in saying it. I remember I was sitting in my own living room, as it were, and I have this picture of Master that is an enlargement of the picture that's on the front of the Autobiography of Yogi. It's a very nice print of it. It's printed on metal, and it's just a very vivid one, and it's a sort of an original rather than there's not that much photoshopping, so it's very vivid. And I was just sitting in a chair in my own living room, and that picture was on the wall, and I could see it very clearly. And a very odd realization came to me, odd in the sense, in the way it was framed, and odd, it was oddly powerful, which I was just looking at Master, and the thought just came to me, I was born for this. I was born for self-realization. And there was a feeling of complete integration, I guess is what I want to say. It's like, I might not be very good at this, because God knows I'm not. You know, I might not be very good at this, but I'm 100% sincere. This is not an affectation. You know, if there was nobody else on the planet, I would still feel this way. And there's a certain relaxation that brings. Just a very, very, very deep sense of relaxation. I'm also thinking about this because I've watched certain friends over the years, because I've been in the same community on the same path for more than 50 years. So, I mean, not only have I seen whole generations of children grow up and, you know, and the next generation start, but I've also watched my peers or my friends, whether they're chronological peers or not, but devotee peers, you know, through more than just a couple of years, you know, decades, 20, 25 years, 30, 40, 50 years. And Swamiji has always referred to Ananda as a laboratory of consciousness. One of the things that happens in our communities, because we see each other completely, and that's one of the incredible, extraordinary powers of community, which is why Master strongly urged the founding of communities, is because you can't hide. You can't, if you just go to church on Sundays and then go back to your own place, you can just organize whoever you want to present. This is who I am. And you can maintain it, and then you can gather yourself up and you can go away. When you live together year after year after year, you can't pretend. You just really know each other, which when I very first arrived there, like literally the first few months, I had this realization that everybody here would know me. I would be completely exposed. And I remember realizing that I had to be completely at peace with that. Because any part of me that was not at peace with that was going to cause endless difficulties. And I remember, and I have a visual memory also. It's like if I can remember the place, I can remember the thought. When I would give a lot of different classes and someone would say, oh, you know, I was in your class on such and so. And then all of a sudden I would see the room and I would see them sitting over there, and then I would remember the things they'd said and the name. But it would come partly with the picture. So I remember standing, I remember exactly where I was standing. I was looking at a bulletin board with some things on it. And I understood that this was a critical moment in my spiritual life, that I had to be comfortable with being transparent, because I was very intuitive about people's feelings and thoughts, and I realized so was everyone else. Just as I could read others, others could read me. So we just had to come to peace with this. And I only realized much later. And I mean, I did that to the degree that I was able. Over many years, I discovered levels, hidden levels within myself, but I wasn't withholding them deliberately. It was just that I myself didn't know. But there's also the thought that we have to present to God and to others a certain persona, and that certain parts of us, we're lost. We don't know who we are. And the process of the spiritual path is coming down and down into all of this, and to getting past our own facades that we've created out of some whatever, and to just being able to be sincerely whatever and whoever we are in front of the Spirit. Because sooner or later, the thing about this path is, which I love, is that it works. So any aberration we're trying to protect, if we just keep ceaselessly acting for divine union, sooner or later it will assert itself and force us to relate to it. That's over decades. That's what I've experienced. You know, pockets of confusion that were so well barricaded. Just sooner or later, karma, a karmic grenade gets thrown into those pockets, and they literally blow up. We talk about it as karmic bombs. That's a phrase that is part of the vocabulary of Ananda. Karmic bombs go off. You're just sort of going along, and then suddenly everything changes. And of course, you've never actually asked for them, but they clear the air, so that we can just get to the point where it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter what's exposed. It doesn't matter what I don't know about myself that I still have to learn. It doesn't matter how hard this gets. And it's not even like it's a courageous decision. It's a very different kind of decision. It's the decision that Peter answered to Jesus. Where would I go? And that's what I realized when I was sitting in the living room looking at Master. Where would I go? Because everywhere I go, there you are. Everywhere I look, there you are. You know, every part of creation that I see, there's no choice. We just have to go for self-realization because there's no alternative. And when we can really come to that sounds like kind of a draconian imposition of divine law upon us, but it's actually just the opposite. So much energy is freed. So much energy within us is freed, because there's just no point in thinking about whether I'm going to do it, whether I'm going to face it. We might think, I might face this very, very badly. You know, I recently had to go through a difficult situation in my life. Just responsibilities came to me that I wasn't interested in carrying out, but I had no choice but to carry them out. I did my best. At the end, I decided I might have gotten a C plus. If I had been grading myself, maybe a B minus. I mean, I really don't think I did very well. But I never thought for a moment that I didn't have to face it. I mean, you see what a difference that is? I might have wished it had been different, but I never, how would I say that? I never thought that I had a choice, which is tremendous freedom. And that's the phrase, ceaselessly engaged. That's why I like it so much. You know, ceaselessly engaged with clumsy ineptitude, but nonetheless ceaselessly engaged. And that's a lot. So, and then, as it says, united to the Supreme Self, by the practice of yoga, he beholds his self in all beings, and all beings in that one self. I was remembering today something that's half relevant to this. A friend was asking me about how do you deal with beggars when you're in, he'd been traveling in a country that's far less wealthy than the USA, and he'd been accosted from time to time with people who were just begging for money. We were just talking about it. And it made me remember from 1986 till 2006, about 20 years, every year or every other year, I would travel with a group of people to India, and we'd go on a pilgrimage tour based on Yogananda's autobiography of the places that were sacred to our path. And we would go to Varanasi, because Lahiri Mahashaya had his home there, plus it's the oldest continuously inhabited city in, I believe, in the world, and certainly in India, and it's always been holy, and the Ganges is there. It's really magnificent. I haven't been there in many years. I understand the whole city has been cleaned up a lot and made more pleasant to be in, which would be nice. But nonetheless, even when it wasn't, it was magnificent. And so every year I would go and we'd follow the same route. And we would go into the old part of the city, the narrow lanes as they called it, because Lahiri Mahashaya, one of our gurus, had his house there. And for many years, most of the years that we were traveling, descendants of his family, Lahiri's family, were still living in that house, and they allowed pilgrims to come in. Now you can't get into the house anymore, except one day a year or something. But then we could just go in. So we always would. And at the entryway to where the narrow lanes were, there was a beggar who was always there. And he was an extraordinary beggar in his physical debility. In the United States, you just don't see scenes like this. This man, I don't know what was wrong with him, but he had no legs. His legs didn't work. I think he had physical legs, but they didn't work. Much of the rest of his body didn't work. He had something that was like a skateboard, but he would propel it with his hands. And he was sort of half lying on it. He wasn't even sitting up, or only half sitting up. And he would his spot was right at the entrance there. And every time we'd come through, he actually got to know us, got to know a lot of our names. He would welcome us back. And I remember one particular time we were separated one from another, and he heard one of us say, "Where is Durga?" She was one of the tour leaders. And he spoke. He said, "Oh, she went that way." And then we realized how sort of acquainted we'd become. His condition was one of the worst you've ever seen. He was radiantly beautiful. He had just the most exquisite face. And it was the inner light that was in his face. He had so much peace and spirituality in his face that you just felt uplifted. Sometimes as we laughed, we would forget to give him money because you would just feel so like this man doesn't need anything from me. And he was such living proof. Who knows what the karma was? But whatever it was, he had faced into it with so much power that it had made him a saint. There was just no question about it. I think by the last times we were there, he wasn't there anymore. Presumably he died, I don't know. But I was thinking about, He beholds his self in all beings and all beings in that one self. And so when we looked at him also, you just saw this divinity. You didn't see pathetic humanity. You just saw some radiant, triumphant spirit, and just sort of celebrated with him, and then tried to give him money because he needed it to live. So 6:30, he who beholds me everywhere, who beholds everything in me, never loses sight of me, nor do I lose sight of him. And Swami's commentary says, my guru very often quoted that last stanza. His tone of voice and his expression as he did so were blissful. He was reminding us that God is ever near. What seems to hold the Lord at a distance is only our indifference. If we will do the work needed to calm our thoughts and feelings above all, we will find him waiting for us. This is a theme you also hear me speak about often, because it is among, I talk about the things that I'm learning, and then I talk about the things that have been important to me. And there's so many times that we allow ourselves to be influenced by an idea that we haven't examined sufficiently to really know if it's true or not. One of the great blessings of my life was the many, many hours I spent in the company of Swami Kriyananda. And he was very, very kind and very sensitive in the way he guided and inspired us, but he was also demanding. And he was unequivocal in his insistence that we raise our energy and wake up. And so you couldn't just offer him some half-considered platitude and have him just accept it as wisdom. So he forced us, and I was eager to do this, but of course I wasn't good at it for a long time. I'm better now, of course. Why do I really think that? Why do I think that's true? I was amused once with a friend of mine. He was an Episcopal priest, and he became a Kriyaban. He became a disciple of Master. He stayed a priest because he felt that being a disciple of Master and practicing Kriya just made him a better priest. And he was also, he was highly intellectually trained in the teachings of the Bible and the theology of his church. He had advanced degrees from prestigious universities. And so, especially then, because I knew him in the 80s, the early 80s even, before I myself had put in as much time as I have since to reading the Bible and studying Master's interpretation and meditating and reflecting on the teachings of Jesus. So I would often ask him questions. And one of the things that I read when I read the Acts of the Apostles, which comes after Jesus' crucifixion, was that the disciples of Jesus formed themselves into communities. And that was interesting. Here Master came to America and spoke vehemently about the need for communities, and constantly, with tremendous commitment. You know, those of you who share high ideals, pool your resources, buy land in the country. You know, this idea of spiritually based intentional communities will spread like wildfire. It's the social pattern of the future. And Swami Kriyananda devoted himself to that particular aspect of Master's teaching. And Ananda itself, one of the characteristics of it is this commitment to building spiritual community, which we have done here also where I live in Palo Alto. And so there I am reading in the Bible, and all of a sudden I'm realizing that they've all pooled their resources and they're living in communities. And I was really just like surprised. First I spoke to Swami. I said, Swami, look, you know, it seems like Jesus advocated cooperative spiritual communities just like Master did. There's quite a lot about it. And so to my friend, my priest friend, I asked him about it because he'd studied, and I said, what is all this about communities and so on? And somehow it led from one thought to another. And then he very authoritatively says to me, well, you see, the full teaching of Jesus was not revealed all at once. It was over the next several hundred years. The teaching of Jesus was gradually revealed. And he just said this because this is what he learned at his prestigious universities. And this is what all the priests said to each other. And now, of course, he was a self-realizationist. He knew how Master explained who Jesus was and what an avatar is and what the Bhagavad Gita says about whenever virtue declines and vices in the ascendant I, the infinite spirit, take human form to destroy adharma and to restore righteousness to the world. I mean, it's a whole, the difference, what the Gita adds to the Bible is what the Gita adds is it tells you what an avatar is. The Bible tells you that Jesus was the Son of God and was one with the Father. But he just kind of appears out of nowhere and then just disappears into nowhere, and you have no context. And because the 18 missing years of Jesus' life are taken out of the New Testament, you don't realize that he had a guru. You don't realize, and because references to reincarnation were taken out of the Bible mostly, you don't realize that Jesus has lived before, that he was Elisha returned, that John the Baptist was Elijah, except a few things slip in, like that one. When they asked Jesus if he was in fact the promised Messiah, and he said he was, his disciples said, how can that be? Because the Old Testament ends with saying the Messiah will come, but Elijah will come first. So they say, how can you be the Messiah, the promised one in the Old Testament, because Elijah hasn't come yet? And then Jesus says, oh, Elijah did come, but he was not recognized. And then the disciples say, and they knew he spoke of John the Baptist. I mean, what clearer a definition of reincarnation can you talk about? And in another place, Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And then they guess previous prophets from previous lifetimes. And it's perfectly clear that that the concept of reincarnation was there. When there's a blind person that Jesus heals, and they say, why was he blind? Was it his sin from the past? Or was it the sins of his parents that caused him? So what are they talking about? They're talking about reincarnation. I mean, these are the ones that slip through. Historically, now all these things are being verified, that reincarnation was a common teaching at that point because it's Sanatana Dharma. But my friend, the Episcopal priest, in all his academic and intellectual and seminary training, he didn't learn what he learned subsequently when he learned Master's interpretation of all of this. So my friend just says to me, the teaching of Jesus was not fully revealed. I mean, it was not fully understood or revealed, I think was the word he said. I'm not sure. It took 300 years before the teaching was really sorted out. I said, pause, because I had learned from Swami. So Jesus, who was a self-realized master, and he was an avatar, he didn't understand the teaching. And it took 300 years of priests and clerics and scholars to actually really explain what the teaching was, because Jesus himself didn't know. And of course, I said, what actually happened, of course, is that revelation, which is what the avatar offers. The avatar, it's revealed truth. He perceives it. He knows it. It's simply true. Religion is what happens afterwards. Religion is when those who are sincere but don't have the same state of consciousness, they just gradually bring the teaching down to a level they understand. And it becomes a religion. And almost inevitably, it wanders very far away from revelation. And then, according to the Gita, a new avatar is born. And this is where Master was commissioned by Babaji to teach the original teachings of Jesus, not what the church worked out over 2,000 years, and the original teachings of Krishna, not what the priests have developed over many thousands of years, but what the revelation of Krishna, the revelation of Jesus, and Yogananda as an avatar himself, to show that it was the same teaching, that self-realization is the unifying principle, that East and West are the same, and to rescue both traditions from the weight of all of those people explaining what the avatar actually meant, which is to say, to make it make sense to me. And my poor friend, when I said that, and I said it in a kindly way with a smile, he just mockingly, he said, "My life was much simpler before I met you." You know, because he could just say dumb things like that and nobody would challenge him. Everybody would just nod sagely, and he could just live in that false world. I mean, he was a very intelligent, he's passed from this world, and a very good man. And he was very sincere. But we have to be very, very careful. Whenever we hear ourselves just saying something, you have to ask yourself, why do I think this is true? You know, is this really consistent? Swamiji said when he first became a disciple of Master, because he became a disciple so fast, he read Autobiography of a Yogi. He didn't know anything about most of what was in that book, but he recognized Master. He had the samskar. He recognized Master from the picture on the cover of the book. He just knew that this was his teacher, his guru, and he absolutely trusted him, but he didn't know anything about the teaching. And then he, you know, within a week from finding Autobiography of a Yogi, he was living in Los Angeles as a monk in Master's ashram. And there was no working up to that. It was just from nothing to everything. And he said literally sometimes he would feel dizzy at the magnitude of the shift. And then he began to hear many things that Master said were true. And Swamiji, he couldn't accept them, but he couldn't reject them either. So he would just ask, you know, did Master say that? And if it was what Master asserted was the teaching, Swami just had to accept it as truth, even though he couldn't embrace it because he couldn't comprehend it, but nor could he reject it. But this is what we have to do as disciples. I recently was in an exchange from someone, and I had been reading out of this book. The class I was giving in this time slot for a long time was based on the letters that Swami wrote that were published in the book Divine Friendship. And several of the statements in there were quite challenging. I was in the section called World Conditions, and there's a lot in there that is very, very challenging. And someone wrote to me and said, you know, you shouldn't say this thus and so because there are certain devotees who are committed to another point of view and it's upsetting to them when you say it. And I went back to look at what I'd said, and I hadn't made it up. Swami, it was right in the book. And I mean, I happened to be with Swami when he was going through that book for the final time, and I know he read every word of it and made decisions about what to publish. So it was right there, you know, predictions about terrible things. And that whole section from that class has been published as Paramahansa Yogananda's prediction for world events, because it's very important. So we pulled it out. It's its own playlist on my YouTube channel, just in case you're interested. But, you know, my friend was trying to say you should tone it down. And I thought about it, because one shouldn't be careless. And I looked at it and I thought about it and I said, we had to rise to the occasion. I'm not going to make it easy for others. Their point of view is not. Their point of view is nothing but sentimental preference. It's contradicted by Swamiji. It's contradicted by Master. And yeah, that's tough. But that's what we have to do. You know, if we're going to be ceaselessly engaged in activities that will take us to divine union, we have to have a lot of courage. We can't just sort of sit comfortably in what we always thought was true. There's an important point on this which we have to understand, which is there's two aspects to understanding what is true. there is the courage just to look at things and see what they are. Just, that's how I feel. That's how other people feel. That's what the predictions are. That's what's going to happen. And then, what are we going to do about it? Because sometimes, because we don't know what we would do about it, we're afraid to acknowledge it. And that's what Swamiji calls, it's not only that we're caught in ignorance then, but we develop a complex about our ignorance. I'm afraid of the implications of this. I don't want to admit that these are the feelings that I really have. I'm ashamed of these desires. I'm mad at Master for saying that. I don't want it to be true. I mean, all of those are things that we could just try not to have to look at, distract ourselves from, lie to ourselves or lie to others, maybe knowingly, maybe, compulsively, because we don't know what we're going to do about those feelings, or we imagine that all these other things will happen. But understanding what is, and then deciding what we're going to do about what is, are actually two different realities. And we can never get to the second if we don't have the courage for the first, Sometimes that's just the way we have to work with it, and that's what Swami would constantly. And he was so interesting to me because he was so intelligent. And I love intelligence. It's just like, I enjoy it. I was raised by very intelligent parents, and it's just like, the ability to think, to articulate, to reflect on things. It can be useful spiritually, but you don't have to have it to be a spiritual person at all. It's really how much you love and how much goodness you have in you. So intelligence is just kind of over here. But it was, it's a hobby of mine. And Swamiji was brilliant in every way that was wonderfully entertaining and helpful to me personally. And I was so amazed by how intelligent he was. This was when I was first getting to know him. He could just converse on any subject, and he was so insightful. I'm even then I was inclined that way, but I would just be bewildered by situations. Swami would just walk right into it and just parse it apart and make it just crystal clear, whether it was world events or a person's psychology or the way to move a project forward or how to edit a paragraph, whatever, or how to make a good curry. He could just wade right into it, would know just exactly what to do. And I tried to understand. When he was highly educated, but he never finished college, but he was still highly educated. But his intelligence was of another order of magnitude. And I began to remember reason follows feeling. And there was a characteristic of Swami's profile that became less so for those of you who knew him in the last decade or two of his life when he became better known. But especially when he was a young man, before he began to shrink a little bit in his 70s and 80s, when he was in his 40s and 50s, is that his body was the shape of a bow like an arrow bow. And a lot of times in the Mahabharata and other epics, the strung bow and the arrow is a symbol for a straight spine, a lifted heart, and the arrow of concentration. So it represents meditation. You sit with a straight spine, you open the heart, which is, if you lift the heart upward toward, if you're gazing outward toward the spiritual eye, and it's sort of on the horizon line in front of you, if you lift your heart toward that, that's what it means to open your heart. It's not to open your heart like that. It's to open your heart upward to the light. And that creates a certain posture. You can see a straight back and a rounded front like this. And when I looked at Swami from the side, he was what would you say? His diaphragm, he had a wide diaphragm. He was not overweight in any way, but he was robust, which is a characteristic of being a yogi, because you breathe. Swami was also a singer, which is also characteristic of singers. They develop this lung capacity that comes from the diaphragm and the rib cage. but he had a straight back, and he had a bow like this. And when I looked at him, if you thought of moving through and cutting the plane of the air or water or whatever, heart first. His head was here, but his heart was always just a little bit in front of his head. And my posture, which can still go there, although I've worked hard against it, was that I leaned into things with my frontal lobe. And a lot of times you see people who are highly intellectual, they pull the heart in. It can be also that they're very sensitive and they're vulnerable to that. You pull your shoulders forward, but you're not really pulling your shoulders forward. You're pulling your heart back. And then you become very rational, and you push with the frontal lobe and keep the heart protected. Swami was exactly the opposite. Reason follows feeling. And I figured out that his brilliant mind was because he was fearless. He just wasn't afraid. He wasn't caught up in it has to be a certain way or else I don't feel safe. It was, I just want to know what's true. And, it just was extraordinarily instructive. I just want to know what's true. And when I know what's true, I can feel, I can have my feelings, and what's true may be that, even maybe, that I'm angry, that I'm upset, that I don't have confidence in myself, that I've lost touch with. But if that's what's true, you see, whatever is true is running our life anyway. That's the thing I finally figured out. Oh, the mere fact that I refuse to acknowledge it, or I'm afraid to acknowledge it, or have suppressed it so I've forgotten it, it doesn't make it go away. It's still running my life. Except it's running my life in a way that I can't get a hold of because I refuse to acknowledge it. So you might as well just accept it. You can't win. You can't get out of it just by not facing it. That's what I was saying about how this path works. It all catches up with you. And you have to become integrated all the way through. And this is what choice do I have? Whatever it is, I have to do it. And so where I was going with all of this is somehow or another, and this is all about chapter 6, verse 30, is he who beholds me everywhere and who holds everything in me never loses sight of me, nor do I lose sight of him. Somehow we get this idea in our minds because we don't feel, we're not always aware of God's presence within us. We think that God himself is fickle in regard to us. And we project upon the divine all our worst qualities. Swami, they use the word here in verse 26. Each time the fickle, wavering mind wanders from its course. The fickle, wavering mind. It's we who are fickle. Fickle means that we can't hold to something. We're focused this way today, and then tomorrow we're focused another way. So we think that God comes and goes. And so I feel him when he's there, and then he abandons me and I have to struggle. No, it's our fickle mind that moves away from its course because the avatar is unconditioned. The avatar has no karma. The avatar is beyond the three gunas. The avatar is the simplicity of perfect love and radiates without change, ever changeless. All these words. And so we randomly and habitually, as an unexamined precept, think that God's love is more or less present. But it's simply we. And it says, beholds everything in me, never loses sight of me, nor do I lose sight of him. Master is always watching us. Even the sparrow falls not without our sight. But we try to dictate to God basically how he should respond to us. And Swami comments in here about how is it that people think God owes them an answer? for their brief, restless, and usually shallow prayers. Anguished prayers sometimes. Well, sometimes. But when the anguish passes, we soon forget him again. And the divine says simply, I will wait. And sometimes he puts us into a state of anguish again, just so we will do that. I remember this woman telling me when she suffered a great, great sorrow in her life because a sister to whom she was very, very close got cancer and died. And the woman, the person that I met was like in her 30s. So it had been the life had been truncated, and the woman had imagined that she and her sister would spend their lives together and grow old together, and now it was all gone. And the woman said to me, it was so moving, she said, because I was suffering more deeply than I'd ever suffered before, I prayed with more determination and desperation than I had ever prayed before. And as a consequence, I experienced the presence of God in a way that I didn't even know was possible. And as a consequence, she became a truth seeker, and as a consequence, she found autobiography and she found Ananda. She was from Europe, actually, and this was like many years ago when people didn't travel as much. And she came all the way from Europe to Ananda village, to our retreat. And her whole life was redirected and changed and uplifted and transformed in the most glorious manner because of her sister's death. And I asked her, I said, do you think then that your sister's death was a tragedy? And it was a hard question for her to answer, because on the human level it was. It broke her heart. On the divine level, it had been the greatest blessing that she could have imagined, because it completely transformed her. So we really just never know. And we have to just keep going forward with courageous faith. And this is what I was saying a little while ago. What choice do I have? Nothing happens outside the will of God. No matter how egregiously unfair or painful or even evil and horrific it may appear. Everything is a manifestation of the divine. And everything is moving us toward that bliss. You can be angry about it. You can have disbelief. You can have a desire to reject it. But everything happens by the will of God. Oh, sometimes we're tested more than we think we can stand on that point. But each time we're tested, and each time we can find it and realize, I am always with you. Am I not always with you? Jesus said, where two or more are gathered together, there am I in the midst of them. Meaning it's his very presence already there that causes us to call to him. There's a remarkable story from a woman. Most near-death experiences, or many near-death experiences, are all about the great beauty of the other side. I mean, nowadays there are many more. This woman tried to kill herself. She was in despair over whatever she was in despair over. And she tried to commit suicide. And she found herself in this very dark place. She said, with all these other people who were in a state of despair. And she said she felt that many of them had been there even for centuries. Sometimes by the costumes they were dressed in and their attitudes. She said she felt that, and she was aware that there were other people who had killed themselves. And that state of despair was still with them, and they hadn't yet come out of it. And she was horrified to find herself in that position. And it crossed her mind. She just remembered. She wasn't a church-going person, if I remember this correctly, but she just remembered. She remembered Jesus. Just like it came into her mind that Jesus existed. And as soon as she remembered Jesus, she raised her eyes, and she realized that just above her there were legions of angels. And all of the angels were doing everything they could to project light into the despairing people and to get them to come forward like this. And just as she did that and saw that, she began to rise out of that darkness and rise into the light. She said it wasn't even a prayer. It was just that even in that darkness, she could remember that Jesus was there. There am I in the midst of them. It's really something, it's a tremendous idea to concentrate on whenever we can, so that when darkness overtakes us, as inevitably it will, because we all have karma that we have to work out, we will have built within us an understanding of an alternative to that darkness. That's the good and bad karma. If we just keep putting energy as much as we can into the good karma, it will take over, and the subconscious mind will offer it to you, in the hour of your need. I've shared with you before, but it's exactly apt to this. When I was in a very difficult situation and someone I loved was suffering greatly, and there was nothing I could do to help them because of the circumstance, and other people were sort of looking to me to be strong, and I needed to be strong, but I finally had to separate myself and find a private place, which happened to be in my car in the dark, and the emotion of it just cracked me, and I was weeping and in a state of great distress over everything. And this thought, and I always tapped my right ear because I felt like the thought came from outside of me. It went in my ear, it traveled through my brain, and then it left. So it was like it was given to me to consider. It was very simple. How can this be happening outside the will of God? And I know that came in because, I'd followed a different piece of advice Swami had given me. I'd been practicing when it was easier. This was an Olympic challenge to my capacity to stay in the presence of God. But I'd been practicing when it was easier. I'd been ceaselessly engaged or in activities that lead to divine union. So when suddenly I was drowning, my subconscious mind said, wait a minute, this is inconsistent with all the other things that you've been telling us. Or Master whispered in my ear. But the fact that I could hear him was because a large part of me was bewildered as to why I was so upset. And I was bewildered as to why I was so upset. But I was. Can this be happening outside the will of God? And because I had been practicing for a long time, not being afraid to see what was true, I couldn't dispute. Immediately I stopped crying. I was still heartbroken, but I couldn't just be in rebellion. And then I came up with a prayer that I've used ever since. Well, if this is your will, we really need to get this shown. We need to get through this. And it became this. Whatever it is that you're trying to teach these people, you need to help them learn it, and you need to help them learn it soon, because I'm reaching my limit here. Maybe they have more stamina for this, but I don't. And I took all that anguish and I made it into a prayer demand, and very soon after, the whole situation turned around. Because he is always with us. God is always with us. We just get confused and don't know it. So what does that mean? What are the implications of that? So then Krishna says in 631, that yogi rests forever centered in me who, whatever his outward way of living, sees me at the heart of all beings. That's so sweet. Whatever his outward way of living. A friend of mine had some very bad habits for a while. And he said his favorite expression of Master's was, take me with you. Even if you're going to do bad things, take me with you. And my friend said in his amusing way. So as a consequence, I took Master to lots of places he might not have gone on his own. But he never separated himself from Master, and he was not pleased with his own behavior. But as Swami put it, he never developed a complex about it either, because he wasn't ashamed to share it with Master. It was like, this is what we're doing. And someday perhaps we won't be doing this, but this is what we're doing now. And so when he was ready to shift, he didn't have to find Master in the story. Master had always been with him, just quietly observing, just watching. That's what the Masters do. They just wait. And you have to bear in mind, and this is where understanding what an avatar is, as the Gita explains it, is immensely helpful. There's no aberration, no mistaken decision, no foolishness, no hurtfulness that we can carry out that literally the Master himself has not also done. Because we have to travel the distance from complete material ignorance and selfishness to liberation. And it's like, even though every soul has its own unique trajectory, Master says, we all have our own story, there's vibrations of consciousness. Like I think of it like the keys on the piano. Whenever I think of this, I think from the lowest key to the highest key, and you have to go through like this. And as you go through to get from the lowest to the highest, in this case the pitch, you have to strike every key. And you may be playing a different melody. It may be you may strike it with a different rhythm, but each one of those vibrations has to be passed through. And each of those vibrations is going to assume some manifested form in your personality, in your actions, in your karma. So when you are on a certain key of consciousness, something will manifest that is that vibration. And the Master will say, oh yeah, I remember. Just with complete, yeah, I remember. And yeah, this is why you get there, and this is how you get out of it. There's no horrifying shock. They're not like sort of prissy and, so sensitive that they can't stand, our misbehavior. It's just, yeah, I was there too. I remember. I had to learn that. And then they can project right into us, just project into us, if we're receptive and want to know the understandings that we need. The way the Masters talk to us, they're talking to us all the time. We may not necessarily recognize it because we think it should just be letters of light or something, that everything should change and then the rainbow will spell a word for us or something. It's not like that at all. It's just thoughts come into us, ideas come into us, realizations come into us. And the more we work with that, ceaselessly participating in actions which lead to divine union, the more we begin to just recognize, but the more we become familiar with the fact that when we are receptive, the ideas just come. That we don't have to go find them. We don't have to strain for them. We just have to attune ourselves in the right way. And this is why Swami also said, in addition to Master emphasizing right attitude, when he was with the disciples, he talked about attunement. And attunement it's a subtle word, but it's also a very obvious word, which is we want to know what Master would say to us in this situation. And we have to be unafraid about what he would say to us. And by that I don't mean, we have to understand that he's not just going to be waiting there to tell us that we're bad and how disappointed he is in us and how we made a mistake. What he's going to say to us is something that will encourage us. Swamiji said, even when Master had to be stern, you always felt encouraged by what he said. He said, when you feel discouraged, it's not the Guru speaking to you, it's Satan. Discouragement is one of Satan's most powerful tools. the powerful tool of the guru is that you always feel, okay, I can do it. Okay, it's going to be a little bit of a struggle. Okay, that wasn't the best thing to have done, but I can do it. I can recover from this. Swamiji always guided us to flow with our strengths. He was perfectly conscious of our weaknesses, but he never saw any point in emphasizing them. He defined us by our strengths. He saw us in terms of our strengths, and he encouraged us always to go with our strengths. And when failures came, you acknowledge them. He said it's necessary to be humble, to realize that this was not a good choice. But once you've acknowledged it, it's behind you. It doesn't define you. And we just acknowledge it and we just move on. We just keep flowing in a forward direction, going with the tide that's taking us to the Spirit, and seeing ourselves always in that light. Swami had the most marvelous way of just turning everything in a positive direction. There was one person in our community who was a little bit hard to deal with because they were just so strong and forceful about everything. And some of us were inclined to criticize. And Swami, I remember once he said, "Don't you just love her intensity?" That's how he put it. You know, there were a lot of other things you could have said about it. But there was another woman who was quite charming, and also when she wanted something, she did not give up until she got it. And it was sometimes quite annoying. And I remember I was out with her. There was actually a very large group of people, and we were at a restaurant. We were at a big table, and as it happened, I was with Swami at one end, and this woman was at the other end, and I don't know what it was, but she wanted something from the waiter in the restaurant. And somehow whatever she was asking for was a little either out of the ordinary or not on the menu or a little hard to get. And the waiter was trying to not bring it to her. And she was very gracious, but Swami leaned over and he sort of went like this. He said, "Watch her willpower." And I just watched her willpower. There were a lot of other things you could have said, but I just watched her willpower. You know, there she was. She really had willpower. And by golly, that waiter didn't have a chance by the end. He did just what she wanted. But watch her willpower. Let's just take whatever we are and see it as God sees it and turn it toward the divine. God bless you, my friends.